Yanai na 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 hanai na 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 hanai na 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 ay 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 na 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 ay, 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 na, 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 na. Shalom, shalom, wonderful friends. That's the traditional nigun of Mare Kohen from the High Holiday Liturgy, which I'm sure many of you recognize. Mare Kohen, one of the most famous. And I am so excited to be with you here for what I believe is session nine of leadership. Lessons from the Torah, and then we are going to start. I hope you're going to join us for what might be 40, might be 50 sessions on psychology studies and psychology theories that change the world and Jewish perspectives on them. So I hope you'll join us for that. Everything from Freud and Jung and Frankl to various experiments and studies over the decades. I think it'll be very interesting, and that's part of my background in my graduate work. So it's of particular interest to me. So I'm excited about it. So today is our longest session because it's on the topic of courage and resilience and Jewish ideas of courage. There's just so much to say, and I'm going to speak fast because I'm most eager to hear what you want to say, even though I have a longer presentation than usual. But there may be some errors in the slides because I last minute cut a few things out in the interest of time. So let's start with a poll question. The most courageous one is one who saves others, one who restrains oneself, or one who stands up against the trends and norms. Who do you think of as most courageous? One who saves lives, saves people, one who has inner restraint, or one who stands up against the trends and norms? Okay, so no one here said saves others. We have a quarter said restrains oneself, and 3/4 said stands up against the trends and norms. Very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, friends, here we go. One of the most difficult aspects of leadership is that a leader, to one degree or another, needs to put themselves sometimes at risk. They have to take unpopular stands, and they must have the resilience to bounce back when the risks they take don't necessarily pay off. But we're not striving for martyrdom. We must take risks, but measured ones that sustain our ability to lead in the long term. I see two competing rabbinic approaches to courage, actually a few, but I'll start with two. The first is a type of heroism of public strength, which in Hebrew we might call ometz lev. This is our work to overcome faint-heartedness. This was embodied by Moshe when he summoned the courage to speak truth to Paro, by Avraham when he protested God's decision to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and by Shimshon when he found the power to pull down the Philistine temple. Today, it might mean being a soldier on a battlefield, or a politician on the debate stage, or an activist leading the street rally. The second type of heroism is that of restraint, what we might call gevura. This is the non-violent courage of restraint. We can look to the famous line from Zechariah 4:6, "Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, said the Lord of hosts." Interesting, when I interviewed Noam Chomsky a few years ago, whether we love him, hate him, or something in between, he quoted that line in Hebrew. That line very much speaks to his non-Zionism or anti-Zionism, if you will. And perhaps many Zionists would reject that, not by might, not by power, but by spirit alone. Certainly some Haredi factions would agree with that. More specifically, this idea of restraint is nailed down famously in Pirkei Avot 4:1. Ben Zoma said, it's nailed down in Pirkei Avot 4:1. Ben Zoma said, "Who is mighty? One who subdues their evil inclination. As it is said, he that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that rules his spirit than he that takes a city. Okay, good. Now we can see it, right? Sorry for the technical difficulties. This is explained, this is expanded on in Avot de Rabbi Natan, which tells us one who conquers his desire is considered as if he had conquered a city full of warriors, as it says in Proverbs. One wise man prevailed over a city of warriors. The true warriors are warriors in Torah, as it says in Psalms. Mighty warriors do his bidding. Some say these are the angels who serve God, as it says, bless the eternal, his angels. And some say one who can turn an enemy into a friend. So that is a faith. So in Ben Zoma, we saw the first version, who is mighty, one who has self-control. Then we see Avot Rabbi Natan quotes that idea, but then gives another one. The hero, the courageous one, is not one who beats the enemy, but one who turns an enemy into a friend. That's the courageous hero. Okay, going a little further with this idea of inner restraint or inner alignment rather than physical strength, it's said kind of poetically in Pirkei Avot chapter 5, Yehuda ben Tema says, be strong as a leopard and swift as an eagle and fleet as a gazelle, brave as a lion, to do the will of your Father who is in heaven. So here we see kind of a religious approach as opposed to a kind of militaristic one. We learn from experience that it's not an either or between directing our courage outward or inward. It's having both abilities and picking the right places to exercise each one. Here is a nice Talmudic passage we can look at together from Gittin. Actually, a rather famous one. Very, very famous one. We've talked about it before. I'm sure you've looked at it before. When Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai reached there, the Roman camp, he said, greetings to you, the king. Greetings to you, the king. Vespasian said to him, you are liable for 2 death penalties. One, because I'm not a king, and yet you call me a king. And furthermore, if I am a king, why didn't you come to me until now? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says to him, as for what you said about yourself, I am not a king. In truth, you are a king. If not now, then in the future. Oh, he's buttering him up a little bit. As if you are not a king, Jerusalem will not be handed over into your hand, as it is written. And the Lebanon shall fall by a mighty one. And it says in Isaiah, and mighty one means only a king, as it is written, and their mighty one shall be of themselves, and their ruler shall proceed from the midst of them, Jeremiah, indicating that mighty one parallels ruler, and Lebanon means only the temple, as it is stated, that good mountain and the Lebanon. And as for what you said with your second comment, if I am a king, why didn't you come to me until now? There are zealots among us who did not allow us to do this. So it's an interesting passage, and presumably this conversation never happened. I mean, maybe it did. It's probably something of rabbinic imagination that a rabbi is held in such high regard that Vespasian is having this type of cute conversation with him. It's not about choosing between braveheartedness and the strength of restraint. It's about the wisdom to know when to use each type of courage. Courage requires searching for clarity and making what's often a hard choice, when to push back and when to hold back. In truth, this is one of the main reasons why people don't want to exercise leadership. We're intimidated, like the 10 of the spies, the Torah, who, upon scouting out the land of Israel, falsely reported that the land was filled with giants and could not be conquered, saying, the country that we traversed and scouted is one that devours its settlers. All the people that we saw in it are men of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The Anakites are part of the Nephilim, and we looked like grasshoppers to ourselves, and so we must have looked to them. It may be that the spies convinced themselves that the Canaanites were scarier than they were because they didn't believe enough in themselves. Perhaps it's hardly relevant whether the spies lied intentionally or they simply convinced themselves that the Canaanites were scarier than they actually were. Either way, the spies had not cultivated the courage to do what they needed to do at the time. I believe similar stories play out in our lives. Even becoming a parent or choosing to get married or the like can be an act of courage, because these are scary lifelong commitments. So too, it's courageous today to identify as Jewish. Given the prevalence of judgment and even anti-Semitism. In our era that emphasizes comfort so much, people are most likely to pursue the path that gives them the least tension and stress. We can be skeptical or unsure, but we still need to act. It's not that we will never be afraid. Rather, this type of bravery means we can act even in the midst of fear. Cultivating the courage to do what scares us outwardly and to elevate our baser inner instincts takes time and patience. It requires developing master control over our thoughts, speech, and actions. But we'll see, it's a transformation that makes all of our spiritual work worthwhile. We need the courage to be vulnerable and not just to fearfully share our perceived best self publicly. The renowned writer, activist, and educational reformer, Parker Palmer, together with his colleague at the Center for Courage and Renewal, Marcy Jackson, writes about two narratives that are running through our minds all the time, our ego stories and our soul stories. Our ego stories start in the curated me, the self I present at dinner parties or invite to my interviews. The curated me is linear with an upward and forward trajectory. The narrative we tell when we're speaking from a place of ego focus on life's high points and the times when we have been successful and affirmed. They focus on my story. I am the story. When something throws me off track, my ego voice, the one telling my ego story, becomes reactive and defensive. Soul stories, on the other hand, honor the shadow as well as the light. They notice the suffering as much as the gladness. I'd go a little further and say that they also tell the story of we rather than just the story of me. For some reason, courage was not on the list of classical midot, despite chazak ve'amatz being a common biblical phrase calling on people to have courage. In 4 of the places in the Bible the phrase appears, it shows up alongside, do not be afraid. So even if it's concretized as one, courage is clearly, even if it isn't concretized as one of the midot, courage is clearly a Jewish trait, as we shall see. I suggest that courage at its heart is the trait that underlies every other. Now, this may seem a little bit counterintuitive. If one were to look at the classical character traits, midot, courage is not listed among the most noble attributes. Courage does not necessarily impart anivut, humility. It may be only tangentially related to simcha, joy, and it may actually be counterproductive to inculcating savlanut, patience. But without courage, would one be able to go out into the world and fulfill one's soul potential? Without the spark that illuminates the challenging path called experience, would we be able to satiate the desire to learning and grow? Outside of the Jewish tradition, Maya Angelou said it well. Without courage, we cannot practice any other virtue with consistency. We can't be kind, true, merciful, generous, or honest. It's important to have a disclaimer. Courage is not reserved for the likes of Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Rosa Parks, David Ben-Gurion, and onwards, even though we're going to quote some of them soon. In my view, each of us has opportunities for courage every day. Further, courage does not require putting the entirety of one's life at risk. We do not need to have the temerity of someone like Nachshon ben Aminadab, who in the Midrash, a rabbinic expansion of the biblical story, walks into the not yet parted Red Sea, hoping that God will intervene with a miracle. In fact, the rabbis teach that we may not solely rely on miracles if we are to be present in the world. In Musar, there's no virtue in taking senseless gambles that put our lives or our family's financial or emotional well-being in jeopardy. There's great risk in staying too comfortable and not changing, but there's also great risk in making ourselves and others too uncomfortable and demanding too much change too quickly, as we discussed in a previous session. The first category of courage is, at the most basic level, to understand that each of us is unique. Inherent in that uniqueness is the mandate to do extraordinary feats that will in some way change the world. One of the great mysteries of existence is how to unlock our innermost strengths. And if one is unable to possess self-value, one can never actualize these strengths. The desire to fit in and to be loved is so powerful, but it's also crippling. Somewhere in the world, someone will despise every individual. It could be for one's skin color, one's religious beliefs, one's support for their favorite sports team. This litany of petty excuses to hate a fellow person is sadly staggering. In the end, we want to suggest that this is only noise, static in the ether. In this case, I see courage as having the tenacity to strive to be one's authentic self. And how do we achieve this seemingly straightforward imperative? Firstly, we must realize that it takes enormous courage to hold ourselves accountable to our potential. Rabbi Avraham Yehoshua Heschel breaks down the essence of this potential in a beautiful biblical metaphor. We are all pharaohs or slaves of pharaohs. It is sad to be a slave of a pharaoh, but it's horrible to be a pharaoh. Daily, we should take account and ask, what have I done today to alleviate the anguish, to mitigate the evil, to prevent humiliation? Let there be a grain of profit in every man. This is a great question in the time of Elul. Where am I potentially like a slave of a pharaoh, where I can be liberated? And where am I a little bit more complicit as a pharaoh in various ways? Heschel taught of the weakness of contemporary religion that shows no courage. He later explained, little does contemporary religion ask of man. It is ready to offer comfort. It has no courage to challenge. It is ready to offer edification. It has no courage to break the idols, to shatter callousness. The trouble is that religion has become religion, institution, dogma, ritual. It is no longer an event. Its acceptance involves neither risk nor strain. Right? Indeed, I think this is can be easily said for American religion, which is sought out more for comfort than for challenge, and also of clergy who see themselves more as comfort providers than challengers, for some good and perhaps some poor reasons. Although not everyone has the fortitude for criticism that a prophet must possess, staying true to one's forthright convictions is an apt contemporary embodiment of a prophet's purpose. Of course, the vision for one's life need not be steeped in the purely righteous. Courage means setting a goal for oneself, modest or grand, and having the perspicacity to see it made manifest. Even Steve Jobs, the late founder of Apple, whose life was marked with as many failures as triumphs, remarked pithily that one should go out and pursue the dreams that will further one's life. He said in his famous Stanford commencement address in 2005, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary. Courage of being means asking hard questions. It's an introspective pursuit. This is quiet courage, a courage that radiates from deep within the recesses of our essence, yearning to break free. Mark Twain is attributed with saying, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. On a similar note, Twain is often quoted as saying, courage is not the absence of fear, the mastery of fear. In all one does, I think it's important to cultivate a sense of bravery, an intractable perseverance, and the capacity to have resilience. With the balance mixed of grit and a reservoir of spiritual inspiration, one becomes better equipped to get through challenges. Indeed, before one approaches any type of action, one's vigorous inner life must align with one's outer life. At the center of this quest for enthusiastic earnestness is ratzon, or will. One must have the desire to be courageous, otherwise one can't be courageous if they don't have the desire to be. This is no mere tautology. From this viewpoint, one must seek to build a burning passion and a lasting energy to overcome internal and external obstacles. One must desire to overcome one's fear of pain, fear of failure, and fear of loss. We tend to recognize courage in a person's brave external acts, but those feats must begin with the inner decision to be courageous. The late social activist Maggie Kuhn, who spoke out passionately for protections for senior citizens in America, said powerfully, "Speak your mind, even if your voice shakes." Indeed, I suggest that one must sometimes give rebuke, lest one bear a sin, as we see from the Torah. and be culpable of complicity as a bystander. In those moments, the Torah says, one will come to hate their brother. From this viewpoint, it is vital to never allow this type of moral timidity to invade our souls. Ralph Waldo Emerson in the 19th century once suggested, always do what you're afraid to do. All right, well, maybe that's a little bit of an overstatement. Maybe you don't always do what you're afraid to do, right? But maybe sometimes, as Eleanor Roosevelt famously said, to be sure, courage does not always require leadership, but at times it may require a modicum of followership. Some prefer either to lead or be cynical, but this middle space of participating but not being in control can require a lot of courage as well. At momentous points during one's life, I suggest one must be willing to take critical risks, not life-threatening or impulsive risks, but measured considerations about how one intends to live one's brief moment in this universe. For many, leadership is the constituent piece of the desire to see tangible change. Yet inevitably, when one takes the difficult step to rise up and lead, the critiques not only begin, but may become incessant. These responses often stymie others who would love to lead but cannot withstand the negativity and constant second-guessing. To overcome this mindset, it takes a healthy amount of courage to maintain conviction and propel action. Nelson Mandela, whose life story is the stuff of courage, wrote, "I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear." I'm sure many of you have been to Robben Island in just outside Cape Town. Just remarkable. And my one or two times there, I can't remember, standing, I think twice, standing outside that cell, I was just blown away by that spiritual space of the cell that he resided in for so long. Anne Frank reflected on the dire nature of her situation during the Shoah, only several months before her martyrdom. Here's how she put it: "How lovely to think that no one need wait a moment before making the world better. We can start now slowly changing the world. You can always, always, always give something, even if it is only kindness. Give again, don't lose courage. Keep it up and go on giving. No one has ever become poor from giving." Another form of restraint is taking the initiative to step back and create space for others to shine. Lao Tzu, the philosophical progenitor of Taoism, teaches from caring comes courage. From caring comes courage. Indeed, when one starts not from the ego-filled position to be a hero, but with the compassionate conviction of love, then one steps back when appropriate. To do this, one often needs to rebuild trust and connectedness. In his book, The Courage to Teach, educator and activist Parker Palmer, who we mentioned earlier, writes about the necessity of harnessing the will to not act on our fear, even at a moment when it might feel most appropriate. He's a great writer and a teacher in the Quaker community, if you're not familiar with him. In response to the question, how can we move beyond the fear that destroys connectedness? I'm saying by reclaiming the connectedness that takes away fear. By the way, I've never mentioned this, but on our humanitarian bus, there's many symbols, like it says, "Let's be better humans." There's important quotes on the bus. There's many, many quotes and symbols, butterflies on the ceiling for migration, many different things. But the roof of the bus is red and blue. And part of that is about trying to bring back humanity to the country in times of political polarization, where we see people simply through partisan lens. We see polls and we just see people as voters as opposed to as humans sometimes. And part of the Let's Be Better Humans bus, when we bring that bus to a protest or to a rally or to a site of service, we want it to be disarming and to strip the political identities back into human identities. It's without a doubt an immense challenge to exist in a world suffused with ambiguity. Indeed, most people struggle deeply with living within a gray zone rather than the easy binary of black and white. Some feel the need to run towards certainty and clarity rather than orient their inner struggle with uncertainty. This is understandable, of course. Here's how Palmer continues. "There's a name for the endurance we must practice until a larger love arrives. It's called suffering. We will not be able to teach in the power of paradox until we're willing to suffer the tension of opposites, until we understand that such suffering is neither to be avoided nor merely to be survived, but must be actively embraced for the way it expands our own hearts. I hope that we can try to not have good weeks and bad weeks, good days and bad days. Of course, these things exist. But each day embrace both and seek that balance and live within the paradox that, like, at every moment it feels like the world is burning and our personal world maybe feel like it's burning. And yet there's so much beauty in our lives at the same time. And I hope we can hold all that together. Not everyone can live up to the pressure of living in an unbifurcated world, but I suggest that one type of courage is about continuing to live mentally within the discomfort of uncertainty, continuing to grapple with questions before jumping to answers, continuing to seek truth beyond ideological comfort. I mean, I wake up in the morning worried about my kids, worried about the Israel-Hezbollah war, worried about the Israel-Gaza war, worried about the presidential election, worried about just on and on and on, right? Question marks of the future of the world. And yet, okay, like, how do we not be held back by that, but actually propelled forward in some sense? From my perspective, courage is importantly a product of the heart. Surely one must learn to be comfortable with honest vulnerability. Brene Brown, a professor at the University of Houston and an expert on the diverse dimensions of courage, writes affectingly on the inner nature of courage and its effect on her life. As I look back on my life, I can honestly say that nothing is as uncomfortable, dangerous, and hurtful as believing that I'm standing on the outside of my life, looking in and wondering what it would have been like if I had had the courage to show up and let myself be seen. Such a prospect can be terrifying, and I believe that it's normal for anyone. Everyone feels vulnerable at some points in their lives. To not be vulnerable is not experience the full expression of humanity. Yet being vulnerable is not equivalent to being weak or cowardly. On the contrary, vulnerability is an element of greater courage. As C.S. Lewis wrote, to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. Lewis talks about the great danger of not being vulnerable, of stopping our capacity for love based on that fear and how it will destroy our hearts ultimately. One might think that acting courageously is antithetical to humility, but this would be a mistake. Consider how Rav Kook explains this point. Often a person's heart will feel full of strength. At first glance, this feeling will seem similar to a feeling of arrogance. Right? You feel strong, you feel bold, you're ready to do something great. But after clarifying the matter, the reality is that one's heart is filled with courage from the divine light that shines in one's soul. When it becomes difficult for a person to emerge from this heaviness slowly, they should rise up and at once mobilize the midah of gaiva de kedusha, holy arrogance. One must look at oneself so favorably and find the good aspects of their shortcomings and weaknesses. For as one sets one's mind to seek out the good, immediately all of their weaknesses can transform into strengths. It's possible for a person to find within themselves so much good and be very happy with their goodness. Day by day, such a person will increase their positive activities with a pure heart and full of compassionate hope. Now, of course, this can be dangerous. The notion of holy arrogance, where one feels overly bold and maybe even zealous. But I think for one who is reflective and well-intentioned, I think the idea that one dismisses their bold ideas as silly or as petty, but rather finds their own goodness and builds up their own courage to act, that can be very empowering. The good Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. faced many death threats throughout his life. In the spring of 1968, as he planned a Poor People's March on D.C. to support economic rights for America's poor, he decided to stop in Memphis to help striking sanitation workers who were paid very little and were almost entirely Black. On April 3rd, the night before he was assassinated, Dr. King spoke these prophetic words. Well, I don't know what will happen. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He reached the courageous milestone where he could openly declare, I'm not fearing any man. And thus he found his spiritual freedom. In the book of Psalms, King David wrote that the Lord is my light and my help. Whom should I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Whom should I dread? In this devotional poem, we're encouraged to invest our energies in serving above, fearing the eternal rather than temporal, carnal humans. With such a short lease on life, why should we fear the judgments of mere mortals? In fact, one of the many moral benefits to a belief in God is exactly this, that we can be less afraid of human perception and judgment, potentially. Lawrence Kohlberg, the founder of the modern field of moral development, taught that stage 6, the highest stage in moral development, is achieved when one lives by universal principles, not motivated by fear, reward, convention, or even law. Although few recognize his model as authoritative, perhaps Kohlberg's stage 6 may be appropriate for the great heroes like King and others who rejected societal norms in the pursuit of justice. The other way to avoid fear of a person is to come to see the good essence in every human being. Once again, coming back to Mandela, a Nobel laureate like Dr. King, endured 27 years in prison, and then upon winning the presidency of South Africa, embarked on a post-apartheid campaign of reconciliation between South Africa's white and black citizens instead of vengeance. And of course, there's lots to unpack about South African society today and what went well and what didn't. He achieved this spiritual height during one of the most challenging periods of his life. He wrote in his autobiography, "Because of the courage of the ordinary men and women of my country, I always knew that deep down in every human heart, there is mercy and generosity. In every heart, no one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes from more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. Even in the grimmest times in prison, when my comrades and I were pushed to our limits, I would see a glimmer of humanity in one of the guards, perhaps just for a second, but it was enough to reassure me and keep me going. Man's goodness is a flame that can be hidden, never extinguished." I don't know how somebody can come to that conclusion after what he went through, or even while he's in there, see such goodness. It's a remarkable thing to me. All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the next few ideas and go to our conclusion. The book of Exodus teaches that no one has to make all moral decisions and lead alone. There's holiness in collaboration, in bringing people together, and in building community rather than shunning it. Moshe learns from his father-in-law Yitro that humans have an innate ability to build community, share leadership, and walk together. And no one is truly able to be one's best self when one tries to do everything alone. This suggests that there is holiness in collaboration, in bringing people together, and in building community rather than shunning it. The challenges we all face are not insignificant, actually extraordinary right now, and the right path is not always clear. But Judaism teaches us to reject the ego, cynicism, and radical skepticism that move us away from courageous action. Let us reject fundamentalism that arrogantly offers us pure truth and certainty of conviction. Let us together choose a middle path that is modest and imprecise, yet morally robust. Courage does not mean one makes an appearance and then hurries out the door. No, courage must be practiced daily. It must be developed for years before it's given the chance to blossom. Courage comes from realizing that our role in the universe is unique but limited. Yet it is this limitation that allows us to excel beyond our wildest dreams. It allows us to pursue our destiny. And whether we know it or not, courage is the engine that allows us to move forward perpetually and intentionally with compassion and with the knowledge that meaning is found through navigating the tribulations of living a full, active life. Okay, dear friends, that was, as I warned you, a mouthful. But I am now very eager to hear your questions, thoughts, agreements, disagreements.
Could you talk a little bit more about Rav Kook's idea? I'm concerned because it seems to me that one could easily hijack this notion of divine arrogance just to serve human arrogance and to engage in fear mongering and power seeking.
Yes, yes, I appreciate that so much, Judy. And that was one of my hesitations in sharing the idea. I think that he is operating in a very different generation, writing this in the probably early 20s, 1920s, where the Jew is powerless, the Jew is weak, and I think he's speaking to people who are very bookish, and are afraid of going out in the sunlight, with pale skin, and afraid of going out and digging into the land, afraid of even defending themselves amidst violent attack. And so given that context, I think that's where he's operating. And I share your concern in a time like today, where there is enormous zealotry, enormous abuses of power on the highest levels and on grassroots levels, just to hold our own community accountable rather than point fingers. I think of some of the folks, in the West Bank, settlers in the West Bank, who might be emboldened in the name of religious Zionism to cut down an olive tree or to harass a shepherd, and thinking in the strangest way that this is an act of courage or something like that. And so I think at a time like this, enormous restraint is a great model of courage to celebrate for many, and for other people, and in other times, depending on who we are, the model Rav Kook is talking about. When I look at my children, for example, who are very scared to speak in front of a crowd, or are very afraid to put themselves out there, or very afraid to be cut down by their peers, the notion of Rav Kook idea, find the goodness in yourself, believe in yourself, be willing to put yourself out there, right? And for many people here as well, I think that can really speak to us. But yeah, your concern is very well placed in my view, and certainly could be misused. And to be sure, he was the grandfather of the ideological religious Zionist movement as we know it. And many of those people are, in fact, studying him. In fact, those are the circles where he's most studied. So I appreciate that point a lot. Hey, Dr. Janie Heydrich, how are you?
One of the quotes that you put up made me, everything you say or do always makes me think a lot. But this one, that your outer life is a crystal clear reflection of your inner life. And it just made me wonder what you just said about people who do things that, for example, the violence or whatever, that's easy to understand. But when someone does something, if there is an awareness that is who I am, that is my inner self, that is a real awakening. And it seems to me that part would need a great deal of guidance. What do I want my inner self to be? Do I want it to be mercy and goodness? Do I want it to be whatever I want to be, selfishly and antagonistically? From a point of view of, that's a beautiful thought. Yes. I want to act as I am inside, assuming that that's going to be a virtuous, good, merciful self. But I don't know, where does the guidance come in, so that inner self is what we want people to be, which is mercy and goodness.
I love that. That's a perfect building off of what Judy just shared, Dr. Heydrich. Thank you so much. And I think that is it's such a humble question because we live in an era oftentimes where people are not looking for guidance. There's a sense of self-help books. I'm going to read my self-help book and figure it out myself. I don't need a therapist or a rabbi or a pastor, or, I don't need a kind of a person to support me in figuring out my inner life. I got to figure it out. Thank you very much. And that sense of the check on the Rav Kook that Judy brought up of okay, there's goodness in me and there's shadow in me. So I can't just be bold and find all my goodness and go, right? How do I make sure that part of my inner life that I want kind of projected into my outer life, how do I make sure that someone is guiding me in kind of that filtering process? Because in well-intentioned people create a lot of harm in how they talk to people and how they engage with people in the world. And I think that one of the parts I cut out of this, just because I had too much to say already, was just the word rebuke is too strong. But this whole tradition around being able to give feedback, being able to be in really trusting relationships where you really welcome from someone you trust some of that feedback about blind spots. And I think not many people have that relationship where they're willing to receive that feedback. They have someone whose feedback they truly trust. And there's a ninja-like timing where one can give it in the right way, in the right time, in a way that can truly be heard and experienced and grown. And I think that is so rich and so deep. And because part of it is not only deciphering the goodness and the shadow, the light and the shadow within us. Part of it is also figuring how much of it really is us versus just stuff we assimilated into, stuff we picked up along the way through our traumas and glories, right? And, that sense of this is a deep part of me, right, is really challenging. And, I know a bunch of trans folks, and some of them are I am just so sure that, I am this different gender. And some people, they're really not sure what they are, and then they kind of backtrack later. Right. And that's just one example. So then look at career. Someone feels they're destined for a career, art is just everything they're about. And then a few years later, that's just totally not who they are. What part of that deep self, as it relates to religion, career, love, gender, all these things, which part of those are really fundamental to who I am? And which part of those are just something that kind of got cultivated unintentionally to some degree? And how do I then bring that forth? And, I'll share just one example because I already said too much, and then Janie, I'll throw it back to you. But, I shared last week that I'm just immersed in this adoption case with this woman. And I said to her, because I was able, we were able to find what we believe is the right family for her son. And, I went back last night and said, listen, if you don't want to do this, we can totally backtrack on this whole thing. She's like, no, I've worked through this and I'm totally clear that what's best for my son and what's best for me, is this process. And I had such an admiration for this process she had gone through, this painful and challenging process of her getting clarity on what she can do and what she can't do. And there's a courage there as well. The courage of saying I can't do that. I will relapse in drugs, or I will fall in my mental health. There's things I can't do. And that's really courageous also. So anyways, Janie, I'm curious to hear if that was a response or if you have thoughts on that.
No, absolutely. But that what you said takes me back to one of the earlier quotes that you shared, and that was what religion does, organized religion. And I'm thinking in what your just recent comments, that religion is a blind spot. It creates a sense of, oh, this is who I am, this is what I want to be, without that inner reflection. It's a substitute for inner reflection. And,
That's right.
And what authority does organized religion make itself to say to people,
Right.
This is who you are,
Right.
This is who you should be. And we need to look at what organized religion has done in the past.
Right.
And it's a horrendous legacy. Just so.
Yeah. Thank you. I love that. And without me pointing fingers at other religions, but pointing at Judaism, I would not state, but I would question if the institutions of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in American Jewish life are successful or failures. And I suspect they're largely failures. Why are they failures? Because they're largely about community and about Jewish identity rather than tshuva. Now, of course, there's many exceptions that many people really engage in tshuva, right? But I think for many people, it is so full of distractions, of cooking meals, of listening to beautiful melodies, of seeing friends and community, and all that's good. All of that's good. But all of that noise can distract us from the deeply reflective and challenging work that these holidays were set in place to do. Like, I just don't, in my experience, and I'm obviously pointing to myself as well, I'm not pointing at anyone else. I just don't see a different Jewish community a week after Yom Kippur than I saw a week before. I just don't see it. I don't see us operate differently, and I think we've lost a lot of that element of challenge. People looking to a sermon for entertainment, instead of that challenge, and people looking to the sermon at all as opposed to their own work. So I appreciate your point, and I think that religion, or in this sense, Judaism is in a difficult spot right now. And I think I get it. We're losing numbers so fast that the goal is to make it fun and appealing. Make it short, make it fun, make it appealing, make it beautiful and sweet. I mean, as opposed to, because, that's what the idea is, what's going to bring more people in. But push back. If you disagree with me, push back. Hi, Gary.
Good morning, everyone. On the topic of inside and outside, as Janie just mentioned, and you, how much do you think the outer ego or the ego plays into that? Because I think we all know people that stand up and appear very courageous in community or whatever work that they do, but are really internally conflicted. That their ego has really displaced them of who they really are. And I'm not a psychologist; I treat feet, But I think at least I know a lot of those people that are that way, and I just would get your thought. And the second thing I want to mention about high holidays, I have to tell you that, and I mentioned it maybe before in other classes, that I do not look forward to high holidays. I've never enjoyed them, and actually now with everything that's going on, we're a week away. We'll be with our kids and our grandkids and our machatanim, and like we are every year. And you know what? I would just thinking, I'd like to go to the mountains, rent a place and have some serenity up in the mountains, because everything that you mentioned is exactly how I feel.
Well, Judy's right, Gary. That was some brilliant stuff. It's too bad that Shmuly missed it.
I just wonder whether all of the ceremony and all of the huge crowds and all of that make it possible for someone who hasn't been interacting with the Jewish community to maybe get a foothold that in future years they could come to something that is more deep. I think you have to be for a lot of people, the high holidays are a wading pool or the shallow end of a swimming pool that eventually they may be able to move towards the deep end. So,
I don't. I mean, I'm not being judgmental of others. I'm just talking for me personally.
Sure.
Yeah, that it just has been a turnoff for every, and I've been active in the Jewish community, and it just. Oh, I don't want to repeat what Shmuly said, but it's just me. So, here we are, like a week away. So we're going to have dinner. We're going to have brisket. We're going to have chicken. We're going to have I mean, it's the traditional things, and which I think are important. Don't get me wrong, but it just doesn't do anything for my inner soul, so to speak.
Yeah,
I think Judy's analogy of the wading pool is a great way to think of it, Gary.
Right.
tying
Yeah,
it
I
to what
agree.
you said before, and that is it's a way to maybe entice people, to lure people in through all the ritual and the and tradition, and maybe once they're in, they get past that and think, oh yeah, I can do this. But they're different stages, phases, if you will, of getting to that inner reflection. But
Mm,
that waiting pool is a first.
mm,
Yeah, I like that analogy too. And again, I'm not against it. It's just that for me personally, my kids are really into it, and my parents were into it. And as I have grown in my Jewish education, and as I grown in age, I'm just looking for something different. Haven't been able to find that.
great, Gary. So I do want to respond, but before I do so, I want to give Matthew a chance to jump in here.
I was just going to make a comment. Rabbi Koppel the other day, Temple High, made a comment that the purpose of Elul is you don't just show up and have a wedding, you plan for it. And people who just jump in at Rosh Hashanah without any preparation, without any thought of Teshuvah, the whole days of awe, it is like stepping into the waiting pool, but maybe we should be doing stuff ahead of time to get ready for the holidays, to appreciate the real nature of the holiday. And I think that's very important in terms of Judy and Gary, but you were saying that, the ritual, the music, the food is good, but then it's like you're helicoptering it, you do it without any thought. And that's why
Yeah. Drives.
Okay, I think Matthew froze there, but yeah. So thank you for that point, Matthew. I think that's well taken. That
holidays, I'm very turned off, but now that I'm studying, I know where that comes out.
Yeah, beautiful. I think Matthew froze there, but thank you so much. And I think that's a really great point that that we should decide what we want to get out of it and try to prepare for it. And as Gary's saying so powerfully, and in line with 85 to 90% of American Jews, maybe more, who just are not getting something out of it as it is, and might need something different. And that's an important realization also, and asking the question of what do I need and how will I find it. And I hope that our community has the capability of responding to such needs. Lastly, just your first point, and then we'll go back to Judy here. On your point of ego, I really appreciate that, because I think that on the one hand, I think that Judaism is much more concerned with the right action than it is with purity of motive. And so people who do have a little bit or a lot of ego involved in doing a lot of good, that might be all right, because a sense of self, a sense of self-worth, a sense of value can be a big driver for many people. And yet we also see what it looks like when it goes totally awry, and someone is purely leading from a place of ego, and what that looks like. And those are also good tshuva questions for us in the things that we do, of how we work and how we parent and how we lead, to not empty it out completely, but ensure that we're doing things for really good reasons. Judy, back to you.
I used to have a lot of contempt for once-a-year Jews and people who were non-reflective, and for I just felt that they weren't doing Judaism right. And I think that at least with age, I've become more tolerant of people coming along with Judaism and as part of the Jewish community wherever they are. So if someone is a yenta but is going to make chicken soup for people who are sick, you have to say, okay, she's a yenta, but she takes care of the sick. We have to be loving towards people who are not philosophical or who are not reflective, because we have all different flavors of Jews, and we're a crazy salad, and we go along together. I think we have to be kind not only to ourselves but to our people.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, I'm surprised actually that I never even thought about that. I sort of thought that being reflective is a basic human mandatory charge. But I never really thought about it until you said it, Judy, that actually a lot of people aren't built that way. That, yeah, people think about doing good, but really deeply reflective about purpose and about repentance and about one's misgivings. Like, a lot of people just aren't built to do that. And I never really thought about kind of the limits of our charge for tshuva and what that looks like for people who operate differently than that. And, I'm going to think a little more about that. So thank you. And friends, it's great to be with you always. Thank you so much for joining. And I look forward to session 10 next week with you, just a day and a half before Rosh Hashanah, whether that means a lot or a little to us, or whether you're reflective or hate reflection. And I wish you a beautiful day. God bless. Thanks so much. See you tomorrow night, hopefully. Rabbi. Thank you so much.